Welcome to the debate. So imagine sitting down across from a first date. The ambiance is perfect, the conversation has been flowing effortlessly, but then the server approaches and places a small, black leather book right between the two of you. The bill for upscale sushi is, say, $240.
Oof, yeah, that is a heavy moment.
Right? Neither of you moves. The silence just stretches on, becoming heavier by the second. Well, today we are analyzing the really fascinating no-filter zone discussion between Marcus and Leila to uncover what that deafening silence actually means for modern romance. Specifically, we are diving into the highly charged question of who should actually pay on a first date.
It is such a minefield.
It really is. We're looking at whether true parity demands Marcus's alternating payment rule, or if basic etiquette dictates Leila's inviter pays framework. I'll be defending the alternating rule today, arguing that modern equality and really the unprecedented volume of app-based dating makes shared financial responsibility not just fair, but absolutely essential to preserve any real human connection.
And I will be championing Leila's inviter pays rule, because I come at it from a completely different angle. I frame this gesture not as some gendered expectation or, a step backward for equality, but as a matter of basic hospitality. It is about intentionality that transcends whatever structural changes have occurred in our broader economy.
Okay, well, let me start by laying out the sociological foundation of the alternating rule, which is, it's inextricably linked to the closing of the gender gap. Marcus makes a really compelling point in the no-filter zone analysis regarding the fundamental shift in our labor force.
The economic shift?
Exactly. We are no longer operating in an industrial or mid-century model where one demographic exclusively controls the capital and the other exclusively manages the domestic sphere. Women are operating as chief executives, trauma surgeons, structural engineers. Because of this, the traditional expectation of one party operating as the default financial provider simply because of their gender is profoundly anachronistic. It's basically a behavioral relic.
I understand the economic history you are mapping out there, but have you considered that human psychology just doesn't evolve at the exact same speed as workplace policy?
I see why you'd think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what happens when we ignore that economic reality. If we are genuinely striving for equality, if we want relationships built on mutual respect and equal footing, then the alternating rule is really the only standard that reflects a true partnership. I pay this time, you pay next time.
But does that actually change the dynamic?
It absolutely does. It strips away the archaic power dynamics of the provider and the dependent. And more importantly, it prevents the dynamic from devolving into a transaction where the dinner bill is subconsciously treated as an invoice. When one person is continually footing the bill, it creates this undeniable, often unspoken psychological debt. The alternating rule diffuses that pressure immediately. Both individuals are equally invested.
Okay, that is a compelling argument regarding the fear of indebtedness, but I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes that equality in the boardroom must automatically translate to equality in courtship, and it simply doesn't.
How so?
Because dating still operates on its own unwritten, ancient rules, and those rules are driven by evolutionary psychology, not corporate parity. I champion the inviter pays rule because Leila rightly reframes the issue entirely away from gender and places it firmly in the realm of hospitality.
Wait, you're equating romantic pursuit with hospitality? Those seem like fundamentally different social contracts to me.
They are actually deeply intertwined. Think about the physical mechanics of a first date based on Leila's framework. If you ask someone out, you are the architect of that evening. You plan the event, you select the venue, and you act as the host. Therefore, you should pay like a host.
This isn't about one person being incapable of affording their own meal. It is a traditional gesture that signals value, effort, and intentionality. Asking someone to surrender their free time to you is a significant ask. Paying for the experience you curated is the social lubricant that honors the surrender of that time. That level of intentionality operates on a totally different frequency than workplace parity, and we shouldn't discard it just because our tax brackets have leveled out.
The hospitality framework sounds incredibly elegant in theory, I'll give you that. But we have to look at the logistical reality of modern dating, which Marcus highlights brilliantly. In the era of algorithmic matching and platforms like Hinge,
The sheer volume of dating has completely dismantled that elegant theory.
Well, volume doesn't change the principle. It absolutely alters the math of hosting. An individual in a major city might be matching with 10 different people simultaneously. This isn't some tight-knit village community where you slowly court one person from your social circle over 6 months. This is a high-volume matching environment that generates endless initial meetings and brief situationships.
It is certainly a dense market, yes.
So dense that I would actually compare this modern dating landscape to running a venture capital fund.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No, think about it. You are essentially taking preliminary meetings with multiple startups, trying to figure out which connection has long-term viability. But a venture capitalist cannot fund every single startup pitch they hear. The financial burden is ruinous. Marcus points to a listener who went on 4 first dates in a single month and noted that if they paid the entire bill for all of them, they would be eating rice for the rest of the year.
Right. The rice comment.
Yeah.
The mental load and the financial strain of being expected to always initiate and always pay in a high-volume dating market is completely unsustainable.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that venture capital analogy at all. In fact, let me tell you why framing human connection as venture capitalism is exactly why people are so miserable on these dating apps right now.
Do tell. You aren't funding startups. You are attempting to build a partnership with a human being. And that exact volume you are complaining about actually proves the absolute superiority of the inviter pays rule.
How does spending yourself into bankruptcy prove the superiority of the rule?
Because you are treating the volume of dating apps as an inevitability that our wallets just have to accommodate. But Leila's inviter pays rule acts as a necessary friction coefficient in what is otherwise a frictionless dating market. It naturally scales and enforces boundaries.
So it limits your options.
It forces you to be highly selective. If you know you have to pay for the date you initiate, you budget for the one person you actually invited, preventing you from going broke trying to impress endless algorithmic matches. If you are going on 4 dates a month and facing the prospect of eating rice for the rest of the year, the solution isn't to ask your dates to subsidize your high-volume swiping habit.
Well,
the solution is to invite fewer people out. The rule protects you from your own lack of boundaries.
That is a really interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Because while you are talking about boundaries and friction, Marcus's analysis exposes a much darker side to this dynamic, the social media-driven soft life aesthetic.
Ah, yes, you are talking about the performative consumption aspect of modern dating.
Exactly. We are seeing a cultural aesthetic emerging where being taken care of is treated not as a generous gift to be received, but as a personality trait to be demanded. And it can absolutely mask genuine freeloading under the guise of your hospitality framework.
Sure, they're bad actors.
Marcus presents a highly specific, infuriating scenario. An inviter spends $150 on dinner. They carefully plan the logistics, make the reservations, iron their shirt, and at the end of the night, the guest pulls out their phone, not to split the bill, but to take a selfie for their followers, and then ghosts the inviter at 11 p.m.
Ugh. That is rough.
When we rigidly adhere to rules where the inviter always pays, we create a playground for people who were just there to extract resources. They exhibit awful behavior, order the most expensive item on the menu, offer dry conversation, and face zero financial consequence for their lack of engagement, because the inviter pays rule shields them.
Listen, I will readily acknowledge that the behavior you just described is deeply disrespectful, and I will not defend it. Using someone for a $150 dinner to subsidize a curated social media aesthetic is terrible character. It is performative consumption. But we have to pivot to the deeper psychological signals of money here, rather than letting the absolute worst actors dictate our baseline standards.
But those bad actors are systematically exploiting the very framework you are defending. They use the language of traditional effort to justify extraction.
They do. But let's look at why the framework exists and persists for the vast majority of people who aren't exploiting it. Leila argues beautifully that the first date bill isn't actually about the currency exchanging hands. The money is a symbol. We are carrying Pleistocene-era survival instincts into modern restaurants.
Wait, Pleistocene? From a dinner bill?
Yes, because the brain doesn't just see a $150 dinner. It subconsciously registers a signal of resource sharing, physical security, and long-term provision. This is heavily rooted in childhood observations, watching parents navigate care. It is a psychological safety net. The nervous system literally shifts from autonomic anxiety to a parasympathetic state of safety when someone looks at you and says, "I've got this."
I mean, that sounds highly romanticized.
Let me challenge your venture capital analogy with something a bit more human. Think of it like hosting a dinner party. You wouldn't invite a guest to your home, spend hours cooking them a meal, and then hand them a Venmo request for the raw ingredients at the end of the night.
I have to stop you right there because the dinner party analogy falls apart completely under scrutiny. A dinner party is an exchange among established friends or acquaintances where social trust already exists.
But the principle of hosting.
A first date from a Hinge match is an assessment between two complete strangers. The risk profile is entirely different. You aren't hosting a trusted friend, you are mutually evaluating whether you want to merge your lives.
The context changes, sure, but the principle of hosting remains a powerful indicator of character. Now, I will concede there is a toxic side to this traditionalism, which Marcus rightfully calls out. He mentions a listener named Real Men Stand who engaged in extreme gatekeeping, claiming that if you split the bill, you're not a man, you're just a roommate.
Right. The roommate comment. That was wild.
That roommate comparison is absurd, and the toxic masculinity driving it is super counterproductive. But underneath that poor framing is a genuine underlying desire for traditional effort. People want to feel that they are worth investing in, not just financially, but energetically.
Well, I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the so-called hospitality often becomes a psychological trap. Let's look at the communication and power dynamics involved here. When you strictly adhere to the inviter pays rule, you frequently set up incredibly awkward, high-pressure scenarios.
How so?
Marcus outlines this perfectly. An inviter asks someone out and selects a $200 restaurant without ever consulting the guest on their budget.
Which is a complete failure of hosting. A good host considers the comfort of their guest.
It is a failure, but it happens constantly. The guest often cannot afford to split a $200 meal. But under the guise of this traditional rule, the inviter assumes the guest will simply be impressed by the display of wealth. Instead, the guest is sitting there flooded with anxiety.
Yeah, that's incredibly uncomfortable.
And then the inviter stares at the bill, creating this heavy, awkward energy, waiting for the guest to perform the ritual offer to pay. If the guest doesn't offer fast enough, the whole dynamic shifts, and the guest is suddenly labeled entitled. The alternating rule, or a clear agreement to split from the jump, prevents this intense financial anxiety and levels the playing field.
I understand the anxiety in that specific scenario, but the rule itself isn't the problem there. The problem is using money as an instrument of control.
But the rule creates the exact environment for that control to thrive. It breeds transactional generosity. When someone pays under this traditional framework, it often operates as a covert contract. The no-filter zone discussion references an absolute nightmare scenario where, after paying the bill, the inviter actually says out loud to the guest's face, "So, does me paying mean you'll see me again?"
Oof. Yeah, that is a staggering red flag.
It is the ultimate red flag, because the generosity was an illusion. It was a transaction. It was literally an invoice for future access, or physical intimacy, or guaranteed emotional return. That behavior prompts the guest to immediately call an Uber, text their friends in a panic, and post about the harrowing experience anonymously online. By alternating, we completely dismantle the expectation that paying entitles anyone to anything. You cannot buy access if the financial investment is inherently shared.
That is a compelling argument regarding the transactional nature of certain individuals, and I completely agree that covert contracts are toxic. But have you considered that silence, not the rule itself, is the actual enemy in all of these micro-scenarios?
What do you mean by silence?
Let's look at a much lower stakes example from Leila's side of the analysis, the $18 offie date. She invites him out, the bill comes to $18, and she doesn't offer to pay. Now, according to the inviter pays rule, that is a miss on her part. She invited him, she should have paid for the coffee. But if her date is sitting there harboring deep, simmering resentment over an $18 bill, that is a massive red flag on his part regarding future financial anxiety.
Wait, so you were saying both parties failed the behavioral test in that scenario?
Exactly. Because context and communication matter far more than the actual dollar amount. If a partner is going to hold on to resentment over $18, or if an inviter is going to use a $200 meal to hold someone emotionally hostage, the core issue is a profound inability to communicate. The inviter pays rule works beautifully when executed with grace. You offer graciously and you receive graciously.
And when they don't communicate?
When nobody says anything and everyone is just silently stressed at the table waiting for the check to be cleared, you are witnessing a real-time preview of how they will handle a mortgage or a medical bill or a sudden layoff.
You know, that is a point where I think our perspectives actually synthesize quite well. The first date bill, regardless of the specific rule you subscribe to, is truly a preview of long-term financial compatibility and conflict resolution. Which actually brings us back to the ultimate stress test from Marcus and Leila's discussion, the $240 upscale sushi third date scenario.
Ah, yes, the perfect collision of our two frameworks.
Precisely. In this scenario, they have been loosely alternating up to this point. For the third date, she chooses the upscale sushi place. She assumes he will pay because he is the man, a sudden reversion to traditionalism and your psychological safety net. He, however, assumes she will pay because she chose the highly expensive venue, adhering strictly to the alternating rule they seemingly established. The bill arrives and there is dead silence.
It's agonizing.
This silence represents an entire conversation they never had the courage to initiate. The ability to directly communicate budget constraints or expectations before sitting across from a $240 bill is the ultimate marker of maturity. Being able to look at a partner and say, let's do something chill, or I'm on a strict budget this week, without feeling a sense of shame or fearing judgment is what actually determines the survival of the relationship.
We are in complete agreement on that front. We desperately need to retire the societal idea that talking about money is tacky or unromantic. Money is literally woven into the fabric of every long-term relationship eventually. If you cannot have a calm, regulated adult conversation about a dinner bill, it reveals a structural flaw in the relationship's foundation that no amount of chemistry can fix.
So, to summarize my position, in light of our discussion today, I still firmly believe that an alternating approach best protects both parties in the modern landscape. It shields individuals from the sheer financial strain of high-volume app dating, where funding endless first dates is mathematically ruinous. But more importantly, it dismantles the toxicity of covert contracts and transactional expectations. It ensures that both people are sitting at the table as equals, actively investing in the connection rather than navigating the outdated, anxiety-inducing power dynamics of provider and dependent.
And I maintain that the inviter pays standard is the superior, more human framework. It preserves intentionality in a dating culture that desperately lacks it. It acts as a necessary friction that naturally filters out the chaos of high-volume, low-effort matching by forcing people to budget for the connections they truly value. Furthermore, it honors the evolutionary and psychological weight of hospitality, acknowledging that the gesture of paying signals safety, provision, and care in a visceral way that clinical 50-50 splitting simply cannot replicate.
Well, despite our different frameworks, it is clear we have found significant areas of convergence based on Marcus and Leila's core revelations. The mechanical act of exactly who hands the credit card to the server matters far less than the energy and intent behind the gesture. Direct communication, mutual generosity, and genuine respect are non-negotiable elements that no arbitrary rule can replace.
Absolutely. I keep returning to Leila's closing concept from the no-filter zone, which I find incredibly profound and really worth unpacking. She states that a dynamic where one person always pays and the other person never contributes in any way, whether financially, logistically, or energetically, transforms a partnership into a sponsorship.
A sponsorship? Yeah, that is a brilliant distillation of the problem. Because what is a sponsorship in the real world? It is a purely transactional exchange where a corporate entity puts money behind an athlete or an influencer strictly for return on investment and brand visibility. It is entirely conditional.
Precisely. In a romantic context, if you are merely sponsoring someone's lifestyle, what is the ROI you are extracting? It usually demands subservience or physical access or the ability to dictate the terms of the relationship. It perfectly encapsulates the danger of taking either of our positions to their toxic extremes. If you demand to always be paid for, you might end up sponsored rather than loved.
It suggests there is much more to explore in this discussion for anyone navigating modern romance. Listeners should critically examine their own financial communication, the hidden assumptions they make when the bill arrives, and whether their behavior invites a partner or a sponsor.
Because at the end of the day, the bill is always going to arrive. The question is whether you perceive that little black leather book as a burden, an invoice for services rendered, or a genuine opportunity to show up for the person sitting across from you.
And that brings us right back to the core tension. We can debate the rules of modern romance endlessly, and we can draw up the most perfectly equitable behavioral frameworks in theory. But when two human beings actually sit across from one another, it is the invisible, psychological structures they build together that will ultimately determine if the connection can endure the cost.